You guys know what's fantastic, what's like really awesome? Print. Print is amazing. Because you can like put the words on the paper and then they just stay there. Like you don't have to worry about keeping it updated all the time. And so the fact that we have literally millennia, thousands of years of history of being able to communicate through the written word in print means that all of our communication techniques for communicating meaning and hierarchy and priority and relationships in what we're communicating all come through the visual styling that we have invented for print, which is all really based on a foundation that we have control, that we have control over the framework and the presentation. And so then we had to go and invent the web, which I think we can all admit was totally worth it. But man, is it a pain in the ass. I mean, you constantly having to keep it updated, all the care and feeding that goes into it. I mean, it's exhausting. So anybody who knows me knows that I am actually like a huge nerd for technology history. Like I love the history of how we kind of came to invent these machines. And so the really fascinating thing is that the web, it just turned 20. It's literally like only 20 years ago that we invented this technology that has really transformed human society. And when you look at the history of like where this came from, the very foundations of what makes the web itself, the hypertext markup language, HTML, and the uniform resource locator, the URL, those were created with the intent that anyone, anywhere, would have the tools to be able to create a document that could then be uploaded instantly and accessible globally. Now, when you kind of take a step back from the day-to-day work that we do and really stop to appreciate just how transformational that is in the history of human communication, I mean, just how different that model is from all of the previous models that we had before it, 20 years isn't nearly enough time for human beings to kind of wrap their head around what's changed. And so, the desktop web was in fact just the beginning. And so for the last 20 years, we've really been able to kind of like band-aid ourselves along by pretending that the web was like print, by pretending that a computer screen was kind of like a piece of paper. We could treat it as though it was basically like a sheet of paper, right? But then mobile came along, and it has forced us to acknowledge or to give up our shared hallucination that we have control over what somebody sees on the web in the same way we had in print. That the idea that now people will be engaging with us, seeing our content on a wide variety of different screen sizes and platforms and device types and resolution, that we don't have any control over how somebody looks at our content. We don't have any control over what kind of input device they use to interact with it. And the truth is, that was always true of the web. We were just able to pretend that it wasn't. But with mobile and now with tablets, we are forced to give up this shared hallucination and instead acknowledge the truth of the fact that the web is different. The web is this fluid, hybrid animal where now we have this need to figure out how we get our content onto any device or screen size or platform that somebody else wants to consume it on. And so this is real. This is what's happening like right now today. We're forced to kind of wrestle with these problems. And yet I still even see people still kind of clinging to this notion of, yeah, but we can still treat this like a page. We can maybe it's differently sized pages, but we were able to deal with differently sized pieces of paper. Like that's, if we still use all of those same models, that'll still work, right? So I want to confess, I'm not a futurist. Like, I'm not here to try to convince you or persuade you of what the next big thing is going to be. Like, I don't know what new platform or device is going to capture the public's imagination. But whatever that next wave of device adoption is, our content's going to have to be ready to go there. So maybe the next big wave is going to be smart TVs. Like a lot of people anticipate that, getting the living room will be the next big battleground. And so getting our content onto yet another form factor might be the next big challenge. And so here you even do start to see, at a certain point, this does start to break down. When you try to imagine using the same publishing techniques to get our content onto the smallest smartphone screen size all the way up through the largest smart TV, you start to realize that the very notion of thinking of these screens as differently sized pieces of paper starts to break down. I'm not saying we can't do it, it's certainly possible, but you realize that, oh wait, maybe that concept of the frame, of the container, needs to change too. And so I think that the potential reality, or the very near-term likelihood that people may want to be consuming the web on smart TVs and smartphones starts to suggest that maybe we have to think about our content a little bit differently. Or maybe the next big thing is going to be like an in-car audio system or an in-car internet. Now, the idea that audio-based interfaces might become a reality, might seem, unlikely and futuristic, especially if you look at the state of audio interfaces today. It's easy to, joke around with Siri and laugh at the mistakes she makes and kind of go, oh, well, this technology, it'd be kind of neat if it worked, but it's obviously not ready for prime time yet. You know what else wasn't ready for prime time for a long time? Touchscreens. Touchscreens sucked. For like 20 years, there was this sense that touchscreens was an almost quite there but not ever going to be ready technology. You'd go to the ATM and you'd have to angle your finger just exactly right to get the button to push. And then one day touchscreens worked. And they worked perfectly. And it transformed everything about our industry in about the space of 5 years. So I don't know when it's going to happen, if it's 5 years, 15 years, 50 years. But at some point, audio interfaces are going to become a reality. And our content's going to have to be ready to go there. And so when you think about what it might take to ready our content for an audio interface, you really start to see how some of these things break down. When you look at even the smallest little HTML tag, like the italics tag. I've had conversations with developers where they're like, Karen, why do we have to bother parsing out what the difference is between italics and emphasis when every single browser since the dawn of time has rendered emphasis as italics? Not in an audio interface, they won't. See, one of those conveys visual styling. The other conveys meaning. In an audio interface, emphasis would be conveyed through tone of voice. So if you can kind of wrap your head around the idea that even the very fundamentals of how we treat our content would have to be different if we were to think about an audio interface, even down to the smallest little one-character HTML tag, then you can start to wrap your head around why, what it's going to take to make the Star Trek computer a reality. And it's if you don't believe me, take a look at what Google is doing in their conversation group. Google is investing extremely heavily in trying to advance and innovate their platform around audio interfaces. Google can make cars that drive themselves. And self-driving cars isn't even Google's core business here. But how you interact with text, how you engage with the web through communication, that's their whole business. And they are betting squarely on the idea that we will have audio interfaces in the future. So, if Google's at the forefront of this, well, maybe then the future is going to be Google Glass. I don't really think Google Glass is going to be the future. I think Google Glass is going to be the Segway of mobile. It's like a Segway, but for your face. But the fact that Google Glass even exists suggests that there will be a big new wave of wearable technology out there, that there will be huge innovation in the space of different devices, different ways that you can embed screens and sensors on your body and into your home. And so the fact that you might think about, oh, right, what if I did want to get my content onto Google Glass? Well, Google has released UI specs for how you might repurpose your content, how you might reformat it to make it render appropriately in the glass environment. So they've given you basically templates that you can use. What are you going to do if you've designed your content to fit perfectly in your presentation? Like you've designed it so that it'll work great on your desktop website. How are you going to get that content back out so that you can reformat it and have it render appropriately using Google's UI specs? Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody go reformat their website just for Google Glass, but I am suggesting, hey, if you were to stop right now and think about your content as something that might have to live on platforms that had their own device requirements, that had their own unique ways of engaging with the content, how would you think about your content differently if you knew it was going to have to live on platforms, maybe platforms that haven't even been invented yet? So if Google Glass isn't the future, maybe the next big thing is watches. So Samsung's already come up with their Galaxy Gear. Apple, everybody's tons of rumors out there that Apple's coming up with a watch. This is an artist rendition. It's not a real product yet. And every time you talk about watches, people are like, oh, so tiny, can't possibly, why would anybody want to read a document on their tiny little screen? That might be true. But if you thought about a watch as part of a larger device ecosystem, in which the watch could be a notification system or an easy way for somebody to interact with their smart TV or with their audio interface, now you start to realize, oh, right, my content may have to live on a whole bunch of different interconnected platforms. And my job is going to be able to figure out, oh, how do I make sure I can provide a good experience for reading and browsing and searching that content, even in the smallest possible form factors. So a watch, so tiny. Maybe that's not going to be the next big thing. Maybe the next big thing will be stadium scoreboards. Let's get our content where everybody can see it. This is a joke. I put this in here in a joke. I crack myself up sometimes, because stadium scoreboards, they're like all big, right? And I just thought it would be kind of funny if you contrasted like the fact that watches are really small with the fact that stadium scoreboards are huge. And I'm like, okay, no one's going to ever want to do this. And then I turned around and I talked to a client who said that the biggest problem they're facing right now is digital signage. So I talked to a university recently, and they said that they had recently purchased a whole bunch of digital screens that they wanted to put up around campus. And they said they wanted a way to update things like events listings or alerts for students onto these screens. And so that they needed was one way that they could manage getting their content onto their website, their desktop website, their mobile app, and now onto this digital signage. They wanted a way to manage and maintain that content all in one place. And I was like, do you think that maybe you could manage the workflow for publishing to the signs separately? And they were like, ain't nobody got time for that. Karen, this is the whole reason we're talking to you. We want a way to manage and maintain all of that content in one place and have the content that we want to publish automatically update on 3 very different form factors. This is not some like crazy dystopian future I'm talking about here. This is real. This is a problem that this client has right now. And we need tools and workflow and processes that will help them create their content and then have it update, even though the different device types and the different form factors and screen size they want to have it update on are vastly different. So digital signage might be real in public. Maybe it'll be real in your home, too. It's like, we can't talk about the future without talking about the internet refrigerator, right? It's like, I think that the biggest problem facing our society right now is that I can't check Twitter in the 30 seconds it takes me to grab a Diet Coke. So, we've been talking about the internet fridge for so long that I'm tempted to hypothesize that maybe it's not the future. But the future will certainly be a home that is filled with connected devices and sensors. Maybe they're just sensors that talk to your mobile phone and tell you what's going on. Maybe it's something like, instead of a fridge, maybe it's a cooktop that has iPad glass embedded in it so that you can watch videos while you're cooking or look up recipes or see the news. Or maybe the future is what I think is really the thing we're all trying to work for here, which is what happens when toaster printers become a reality? Is your content going to be ready to be burned onto delicious toast? These are the problems that I think we're here to solve together. So today, right now, We are in the midst of a zombie apocalypse of new platforms and screen sizes and device types. Right now, today, we are fighting these zombies to get our content onto the desktop web, onto mobile web, onto mobile apps, onto tablets. Our content has to live perhaps in email, in blogs, in social channels, even in print. And the zombies just keep coming. In the future, we're going to have to get our content onto wildly different device types. It might be watches, it might be in-car audio systems, it might be smart TV, it might be Google Glass. The zombie apocalypse isn't going to stop. And so we have to learn to protect ourselves. We have to protect ourselves from the wide array of devices that keep coming at us, and instead accept that our content will have to live in multiple places. And so what this gets to, like the stake that we have to drive right into the heart of publishing, is this notion that the idea of content and form can be truly connected. Now, this notion of separation from form is something that has been bubbling under the surface for a long time on the web. The web standards movement, the idea that we want to separate content from presentation. But it's really when you get to the idea of mobile and different platforms like audio interfaces that the magnitude of this challenge starts to become real. And when you think about how transformational that is in human history, like, you imagine these monks sitting there copying out documents. For most of human life, there was no way that you could even think about creating a document in which the content of that document and the presentation of that document were separate. Like, it would be absurd to think that someone could hand copy a document or even use a printing press to create a document in which substance and structure or meaning and form weren't so tightly intertwined as to be impossible to disconnect. And yet today, because of the zombie apocalypse, this is the problem that we have to solve. Like, our job is to figure out what we do in order to make it possible to get our content creators and our tools to think about these things as being separate. So when Dan Jacobson, currently of Netflix, formerly of NPR, says that the future of content management systems is in their ability to capture the content in a clean, presentation-independent way, it's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking that this is a problem with markup. That I'm basically saying, well, get your HTML out of my content. Like, get your chocolate out of my peanut butter. And that's part of it. But it is, in fact, only the tip of the iceberg. That the challenge of getting content that is presentation independent goes beyond simply the problem of having a giant editing blob where content creators are asked to dump whatever they want. So I'm fond of complaining about the WYSIWYG toolbar and the idea that we're inviting content creators to imagine that the content management system and their editing interfaces work just like Microsoft Word. And, and this is, in fact, a problem. The idea that the rise of blogging platforms gave everybody, one big blob into which they were expected to dump their content and whatever HTML and styling and formatting they wanted, so that they could imagine that they had the same control over layout and styling and presentation that they had when they were working in Word. And so I complain about the WYSIWYG toolbar, and I get this sense from people that they think that I must be some kind of markdown evangelist, that I have a problem, my problem is with the toolbar. And I'll admit, I have gotten the reputation as being the president of the WYSIWYG Haters Club, and I'd like to tell you that my graffiti crime spree is going really well. I hope to get the message out to you here today, but if not, my crime spree will continue. But the problem with WYSIWYG isn't a problem with the toolbar. The problem with WYSIWYG, or even the idea that we have these kinds of layout tools baked into our publishing systems, the problem is that it's the very underpinnings of how we think that content works. Where do you think WYSIWYG came from? It came from Xerox. Xerox PARC, because they invented the laser printer. Think about that for a minute. So Xerox previously had only been able to make copies of things that already existed. Xerox invented the laser printer, which is a way that you could print out whatever you wanted. But they needed a way for you to actually create that document. So Xerox's innovation of the graphical user interface and the WYSIWYG toolbar, the very concept of what you see is what you get, they didn't invent that and then try to figure out what to do with that. They invented a laser printer, and then they invented the graphical user interface in order to sell their laser printer. Now, the graphical user interface is at the heart of people's adoption of desktop computers, and then leading from that, the web. Like, in a sense, we all have a job today because of the graphical user interface. But the fact that that was created to sell laser printers is something that I think gets lost, in that the web is not a laser printer. Like, we owe a lot to the graphical user interface, we owe a lot to the WYSIWYG toolbar, but the truth is, the web doesn't work like that. There is nothing about the web that shares anything in common with a laser printer that is printing out a document that you made in Microsoft Word. Ted Nelson, hypertext pioneer, says that imitating paper on a computer screen is like tearing the wings off a 747 and using it as a bus on the highway. The web is better than that. The web can do more than that. The web works differently from that. And yet, we are still using an antiquated metaphor from the desktop publishing revolution 30 years ago to explain to people how publishing on the web works. It's time that we moved beyond this. It's time that we started creating new mental models, new metaphors to help explain to content creators that now you have chunks of content stored in field that will be dynamically published to lots of different places. Those chunks of content will live on lots of different screens. They can be combined and recombined in different ways. And that their job as content creators isn't to imagine how their content is going to appear on an imaginary page that doesn't really exist. Their job as content creators is instead to create a flexible system, a reusable system of chunks of content that can go lots of places. I describe this as a war between blobs versus chunks. Blobs are big, formatting-rich, gloppy, messy, presentation-intended, bits of content. And chunks are clean, presentation-independent, flexible bits of content that were created from the start with the intention that they can live on lots of different platforms. It's time that we went to war against the blobs, and it's time we went to war against the zombies. Here's how we're going to do it. So to start, we need to be evangelizing for structured content. Like, we have to articulate why the web isn't like print, why a document on the web or a web page isn't like Microsoft Word, and instead, that content needs to be structured in new ways. We need to replace presentation and styling information with semantic metadata that describes what the content means. To do that, we're going to have to expand the concept of what it means to create content beyond thinking about pages, and instead thinking about packages of content that can be used in different ways. And to support all of this, we're going to need an author experience that actually coaches content creators to think about their content in new ways. Let's talk about each one of these in turn. So structured content. Let me take you back again to the halcyon days of the 1980s, when America had a favorite magazine. And that magazine was the TV Guide. Never let it be said that Americans don't read. So TV Guide, most popular magazine in America. They could have justly patted themselves on the back and gone, good job, guys, we are the best magazine in America. But they didn't do that because they realized that they weren't in the magazine publishing business. They were in the content publishing business. And so back in the late 1980s, long before any of these platforms ever even existed, TV Guide invested in building a proto-CMS. They built a green screen mainframe application. And they told all of our content creators that instead of instead of using Quark Express or whatever they would use to lay out the magazine, they were going to enter all of their content into this database. when they created that content, so instead of treating the title of a program or the genre of a program as if it was only communicated through, oh, well, that appears in bold and all caps, and oh, that's bold text. That was entered as fields into that database. And they went beyond that, and they told their content creators that now when they wrote a program description for each show, they weren't just going to write one version of that program description. They were going to write 3. Write a short form, write a medium form, write a long form. And if you've ever worked with writers, I'm sure you can imagine that predictably their response was, why? Why am I doing this? Why? Why do I have to write 3 forms of this program description? You just tripled my workload. Why? They didn't know. They had no idea where that content was going to go. They had no idea how they might want to use that content in the future. They didn't know that one day you were going to have a digital cable box that would allow you to browse that program guide and see what shows were coming up. They didn't know that one day their TiVo was going to upend the entire television industry by giving you what was essentially a giant, easy-to-use VCR that you could browse programs that were coming up in the future and let you choose what you wanted to record. And they most certainly didn't know that one day you were going to have this magical pocket robot that you could pull out and it would talk to your television set. You could pull up shows that you wanted to watch, and then you could tell your TV, hey, go record that show for me. They had no idea that any of these platforms were going to exist. But they did know that if they treated their content as a structured, flexible business asset, that they would get more value out of it. And so today, if you go to any one of these platforms and you look up a program description for a show from the 1980s, look up something from MASH or for Cheers, they are using the exact same content that somebody created in that green screen mainframe application 30 years ago. They are still getting value from that work in a way that they never would have gotten value from it if they had treated that content as something that could be locked up in Quark files, if they had treated that content as something where the genre or the program name was only communicated through the typography, rather than having structured content that communicates meaning. And so when you think about what it means to move from having content in print to having content that can live on different platforms, you have to replace that what we previously communicated only through visual styling, only through layout or typography. You have to find another way to do that through metadata. So The Guardian, so I like these 2 quotes here. Metadata is the new art direction, and metadata is a love note to the future. The first one suggests that we simply do not have enough writers and designers and art directors and creative directors to survive the zombie apocalypse. That in order for us to make sure that our content will render appropriately on every platform we need to get it to, we have to replace some of our belief that every single page can be handcrafted by an art director with business rules and metadata that will tell our content where to go. And I'm not suggesting that there isn't still a role for designers and creative directors and art directors. I am suggesting, though, that we are going to have to partner with the robots in order to make that happen. And that metadata is the way that we're going to survive the zombie apocalypse by giving the different platforms some way to figure out what to do with that content. And the second quote, metadata is a love note to the future, suggests that if you want your content to live beyond the particular moment in time in which you're creating it, beyond the particular platform you're imagining where you put it, if you want your content to actually have a life in the future, then metadata is a gift to that future. Metadata is what you do, just like TV Guide did, in the hopes of helping that content have more value long term. So The Guardian ran into this problem when they created these things called topic pages. So topic pages are these robot-generated pages. They go into the database. They pull out all of the stories that match a particular proper noun, and they show them all on a page. So The Guardian, they made this mock-up of a page. They're all really happy with it. They hook it up. They start it running, and they realize, oh, snap. We don't have any way to know what the top story is. See, when that story hit their CMS, when they didn't have any editorial priority metadata attached to it, they had no way of knowing whether one story was more important than another. So for this problem, they solved it by having their editors do more work. They said, OK, every time this thing hits the CMS, you go in and you manually encode it 1 to 5. That'll tell us how important that story is. Great. Here's the thing. They had a ton of editorial priority metadata about how important those stories were. It was all visually encoded into the layout of the print edition. You don't have to read a word on this page to be able to pull out through things like placement on the page, how many column inches devoted to the story, the size of the typography, the size of the images, the use of color, the layout on the page. Visual cues that say to you, here's how important this story is in relation to other stories you can see on the page, and also, frankly, in relation to other stories that you've seen historically. All of that information, I mean, that's somebody's entire job, probably, at The Guardian, is to make decisions about how they lay out that print edition, and all of that work is lost when they take it to another platform. When that story hits the web CMS, they have no way of judging relative priority. So when they made the iPad edition, they did something different. They built an algorithm that goes in and reads their InDesign files and looks at all of the same cues that you would look at. Looks at column inches, typography, placement on the page, and uses those cues to build an algorithm that then they use to drive the layout of the iPad edition. Now, the iPad edition has its own look and feel. It's not being driven by print. But they are using the metadata that they can derive from the visual styling in InDesign to drive the layout of the iPad app. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the solution to this problem is that we all get robots to read our print files. But I like this example because I think it shows the challenge that we have of the meaning that we communicate only through visual styling, and how tightly wedded that is to one particular platform, and how difficult it is and how necessary it is to figure out new tools for communicating that if we're going to survive the zombie apocalypse of getting our content onto all of these different platforms. We don't have enough time and resources to figure out how to laboriously go in and have our editors recode that priority metadata for every single platform. Instead, we have to find new tools to figure out how to make that happen. And so what I think this means is, what this really gets to is the idea that we are separating our content from the page. We are no longer imagining that the content that we create is intended to live on any one platform. Instead, we have to think about creating content in flexible, reusable systems that are designed to live in lots of different places. Now, I led the redesign of the New York Times a few years back. And one of the things that you learn when you work with publishers is that they cut a standard set of image crops. Like, you as a designer, you don't get to go to a publisher and major publisher and be like, on this screen, I would like to have a 400 by 300 image. And on this screen, I think a 300 by 250 image would fit perfectly. They laugh at you and they're like, we cut these sizes. These are the sizes we cut. Pick one of the sizes that's close enough for you, and you use it and you make it work. So in this example, they cut 6 or 7 different image sizes. And that package of image crops works across a variety of platforms. If they knew then what they knew now, might they have chosen slightly different sizes to get those images to render just perfectly across a variety of different platforms and devices? Sure, maybe. But the idea that in the abstract you could come up with a set of image sizes that would work pretty well across every platform you wanted to get it on. It could work pretty well across platforms that haven't even been invented yet. If you can get the idea that having a flexible set of image sizes will enable you to do pretty good on the platforms you want to get to, then you can wrap your head around how you might do that for different text objects like headlines or summaries. One of my big pet peeves in the web space is when people truncate their headlines. So Daily Beast here is like, can't possibly allocate enough room for this headline because, well, it's like, we're kind of fond of that giant glob of white space there, so, not really enough room for the headline. NPR is like my go-to example of how you do structured content well, and even they truncate their headlines in their mobile app. The Guardian, friends at The Guardian have an entire Tumblr devoted to celebrating the work of the tireless men and women who shorten headlines so they'll fit on your phone. this doesn't make any sense, okay? Like if you are a publisher, your entire business, like all you do, the entire point of you having a website is that somebody is going to read one of these headlines, decide they want to read the story, tap on it, and actually read it. That's it. That's your business model. And so the idea that you have decided that you can't possibly allocate enough space to show the entire headline goes against the entire foundation of what you do. So how can this vexing problem be solved? So one solution would be through design. Simply allocate enough space in the design for the headline. I understand that there are trade-offs, and somebody might reasonably say, but we want to fit as many headlines on the mobile phone screen at one time. So okay, here's another solution. Why don't you cut different forms of the headline? Cut a short form of the headline that will fit on mobile. Perhaps you can use that in other contexts. So Slate recently announced that they are now cutting 2 forms of their headline, one of which they use on the website and the other is intended for social media. And that gives them the flexibility to have 2 different versions. Gawker Media also just recently mandated that none of their headlines can be longer than 70 characters because they were running into problems with not being able to have enough room for them. So I don't necessarily want to say that we should limit one platform by the constraints of another, but I do think there's a lot of benefits to come from saying, why don't you just cut different forms of these headlines? And the publishers probably will wake up to this first because they're like, oh, right, we get business value if we can more effectively display this content in social channels or in search. But beyond that, lots of other companies need to wake up to the fact that their product names, their product descriptions, their email subject lines, the titles of different things that they publish all might need to have different forms in order for them to do the best job on different platforms. So if you can wrap your head around that for headlines, then you might also wrap your head around it for summaries. So Blockbuster, when they looked at designing their video rental page, was like, well, can't possibly know how long the description of a movie summary is going to be, right? So they decided, well, we'll just give you 3 lines of the movie summary, and then if you want to read the rest of the description, you can click to see more. Except the problem is sometimes when you click, you get like 4 more words. And honestly, it's like, this page here, what's the whole point of this page? The entire intent of this page is that you will read the description of the movie, decide that you want to rent the movie, and then buy it. Couldn't find enough space to actually do that on this page. Blockbuster is bankrupt. You know why? Digital native business, Netflix. Digital native business solves this problem in a different way. They cut 2 different forms of their movie summary. They cut a short form, and they cut a long form. And then they use either one of those versions every single place they need to. Netflix is on something like 400 different device types, 400 unique SKUs. You can watch Netflix on your phone, on your tablet, on your computer, on your TV. You can watch it on your toaster. And they don't ever have to truncate their summaries. You know why? Because they can go to their designers and they can say, here's the short form, here's the long form. Pick the one that works for you and design around it. Imposing these kind of constraints, or more to the point, thinking about content as a flexible, structured system that is intended for reuse, I believe will actually make our process easier. It's better for designers, it's better for content creators, and it will create a better experience in the long run. And I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that I'm saying, oh, well, Karen says cut a different headline for mobile. I don't want you to, this Verizon example here. I'm pretty confident that somebody here at Verizon knows the difference between Backup Assistant Plus, and Backup Assistant SM. I don't. So if my job today is that I want to go and figure out how to back up my phone, I got to tap into each one of these things, read the content, figure out if it's what I want, and tap back out. Jared Spool calls that pogo sticking, and he says it's a sign that the site isn't very well designed because the user doesn't have enough context to know if what they want is going to be behind the link that they're tapping on. So Comcast, faced with a similar problem, wrote a short little navigation summary for each of their pages. So if my job today is that I want to come in and change my PIN, could I figure out that that lived under accounts and identification? Sure. But the fact that they put that magic keyword PIN in there makes me feel 100% confident that I know what I'm going to get when I tap. So I'm not suggesting that you go out and create. I'm not saying, oh, Karen said go out and write this like special little summary for mobile. What I'm saying is think about creating a flexible set of reusable types of content. If you can think about creating a set of image crops that'll work across platforms, you can think about creating a set of headlines and summaries that'll work across platforms. Don't think about creating content for a specific context. It's not your iPhone headline or your tablet summary. It's a package of content that can be used in lots of different places. And thinking about it that way will give you lots more flexibility and lots more opportunity to design the right experience. And so all of this sits on a foundation of having an author experience that actually guides content creators to do this well. When I talk about structured content, when I talk about having people add semantic metadata to what they're creating, I often hear people complain. Well, it's like, this CMS is terrible. It's like, look at all these fields. It looks like a database got drunk and vomited all over the screen. And it's true. I get to see a lot of companies' content management underpants, and the user experience for what we give content creators is often this frustrating thicket of fields and drop-downs and checkboxes. And you go talk to people about what their experience is, and they're like, oh, well, you got to ignore all these fields and then hunt around for this one thing that you want. It's a mess. I often describe content management as the enterprise software that user experience forgot. And when you hear people, when I talk about the importance of this, people, developers, people in the working in the CMS space always say, oh, Karen, no one's ever going to go for this. My content creators, they hate all those fields. They complain about it all the time. They want Microsoft Word. They beg for a WYSIWYG toolbar. They insist that what they need is something that works just the way the tool that they're already using does. They don't want to have to adopt a new way of working on the web. They want to use tools that are familiar to them. And this brings to mind this apocryphal quote. Henry Ford did not say this. I don't care. I'm going to use it anyway. He said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Right now, when we are building content creators, tools that work just like Microsoft Word, we are essentially building them faster horses. We are letting them get away with imagining that what they do on the web is the exact same model as what they did in the past. But we're not building them horses, we're building them cars. Cars work fundamentally differently, and it is our job to help people understand the ways that the web is different. You know who has had to adapt to understanding how the web is different? Graphic designers. And I have watched them succeed. I have watched people designers move from their belief in pixel-perfect control and the styles and values and underlying design aesthetic that was rooted in print to developing an entirely new aesthetic and a new values system that defines what good design means on the web. I have watched them change their processes, their tools, their methodology, and embrace the flexible, fluid nature of this new medium that we work in. If they can do it, content creators can do it too. But we have to help them. We can't give them interfaces that look like a database got drunk. We have to customize the author experience to help guide them through that process. If somebody had an e-commerce checkout process, somebody had to fill in a series of form fields in order to get to the end where they would click submit and give you some money, they would know everything there was to know about that process. They would look at every place that there was red in that funnel, every place where there was friction in the system, every place where users ran into problems and they had to, they were making mistakes or they were dropping off. You would optimize that workflow. You would go in and you would try to diagnose every single time somebody was making an error, making a mistake, dropping out of the flow, and you would try to fix it. Because you would know that every time you could get some of the friction out of that system, that would be business value. Well, if you're in the business of creating content, and I swear everybody these days is in the business of creating content, then optimizing your content management author experience is every bit as important to business value as this e-commerce funnel. And I don't know anybody who does usability testing or gathers analytics or performance data on how well their CMS works. We need to treat the author experience as if it is every bit as important to business value as any other workflow that we have in our company. And I'm not just saying this because I'm like a longtime UX person. I'm not just saying this because I want to have happy internal users of the CMS. I'm saying this because I think that beautiful software, great software, easy to use software shouldn't be seen as a luxury. It should be seen as an expectation. That we should move in the direction of investing more in the author experience for content management because we understand that having a better workflow for our content creators is what's going to enable us to survive the zombie apocalypse. It's what's going to enable us to create structured content that has the right metadata attached to it, to create content packages of different content structures that will live on lots of different platforms. Let me leave you with this. The web, it is not print. And I think it's important that we be patient with ourselves when you recognize that we have had thousands of years of human history to build our processes and mental models and workflows and value systems around what makes print work and what makes print great. And we've really only had 20 years of the web to understand what it means to separate content from form, to understand what it means that our content production processes have to be different. But the way that people create content has to change. Like, we can't rely on outdated mental models and metaphors from 30 years ago to help communicate to people what it means to publish content on the web. We have to invent a new way of publishing and a new way of thinking about content that will allow us to fight off the zombies. Their future is going to be a never-ending battle against different new devices and platforms and screen sizes and resolutions. And if I know one thing about the technology field, I know that that's not going to stop. That whatever new device or platform or new widget or technology captures the public's attention, we're going to have to get our content onto it. And so the smart companies are the ones that today are going to recognize that we have to change the way we're thinking about content to make that happen. Thank you.